Hello, thank you for joining me here at Bert's Books. This time I'm going to be talking about something that a book I haven't visited really since sometime in the 90s. So it's been a long time and I just very randomly stumbled over it on one of those freebie shelves at a tube station. I was just, oh, it's been a long time. It is Robert Harris's Fatherland, I think published sometime in the early to mid 90s at a time when the crooked cross was fairly commonplace still on the covers of historical thrillers, less so now, I suppose. So for the sake of diplomacy, I've tried to, well, actually it's rather see-through parcel tape there, but you get my intention anyway. Now this book, I suppose, is a fairly ingenious alternate history treatment. It goes on the supposition, not a very comforting one for most of us, that Hitler succeeded largely in his Second World War aims, and the book is pitched in the mid or early to mid 1960s, I think 1964 or so, where in this alternate timeline, the German Empire as it is at that point stretches from the Urals and throughout Europe. They've occupied the Soviet, the industrialized areas of the Soviet Union, but there's this kind of permanent state of bandit warfare east of that, which is, I suppose, a far larger territory. But this seems to satisfy the Hitlerian desire for, I suppose, a wild frontier where guerrilla warfare keeps the German people on this state of high readiness. It also depicts, I suppose, paralleling developments that did happen. This state of, there's a certain amount of terrorist activity within Germany and a certain amount of, I suppose, student unrest and these kinds of things, mirroring in some way the actual 1960s. In fact, there's a lot of little in-jokes, like there's this quite funny little in-joke, I suppose an oblique, well not so oblique, reference to the Beatles. It doesn't name them, but it mentions this bunch of Merseyside lads who were appearing in these clubs in Hamburg and whose rather primitive music is contrary to that which the regime approves of. But Harris very cleverly constructs, I suppose, the state of that regime as if it had continued to exist for another couple of decades and had succeeded in its Second World War aims. And it quite cleverly extrapolates and describes the kind of life that people, Harris sort of projects, would have been living in this, how are we to describe it, this kind of morally depraved vision of a particular utopia. It's a sort of rather grey, suppressed life for most inhabitants, and this kind of, there's this feeling of cult membership about it, the atmosphere of people's kids. I mean, sort of, you see this in 1984 and books like that, where, sort of based on the atmosphere created in Germany and other regimes at the time, where, people were afraid of their own children or your neighbour's children denouncing you. There's a lot of this. In fact, the main protagonist, he sort of exists in this condition of rather painful fatherhood too. He's separated from the kid's wife, but he's trying to, keep the kid on side in his affections, and the kid is a member of, one of these junior Cub Scouts from Hell organisations. I think pre-Hitler Jugend, I think they called it the PIMP, which must mean something else in German. Or it's probably an acronym for something, but you could see this really kind of difficult relationship between father and son, because Daddy is not a joiner in. So, I'm kind of rambling away without really getting into the plot, and I suppose we should get somewhere to the plot of this. The main character in this is this police detective. He's nominally an SS member, but I think he's working for the criminal police rather than the secret police. So he's kind of not really one of the party Kool-Aid drinkers, even though he does wear that badge on him. And it starts with the appearance of a corpse that's apparently drowned in one of the lakes around Berlin. The corpse has been discovered by a junior, like an SS cadet, sort of, very young guy who supposedly has been out on his morning run, a very early morning run, suspiciously early, and discovers this kind of waterlogged corpse on the banks of the lake. So at first the criminal police are called. The main character, Xavier March, or March, I'm getting that right, played in the film. This was filmed, incidentally. He was played in the film by Rutger Hauer. I wasn't convinced Rutger Hauer particularly was the, not to put his acting down, but I was never convinced he was really the right guy for that role, but it's not a bad film. Anyway, this character, Xavier March, is some things don't add up about this body. I mean, at first they struggle to identify it, and the circumstances of the young man discovering it seem odd to him. He quickly rumbles that this SS cadet is probably gay on the quiet, which is a dangerous thing even in the 60s, a dangerous thing to be within that organisation. So he kind of leans on the guy for more information, using that as a little bit of leverage, I suppose. But anyway, so then there's this mystery of who this body is, how they actually died, what they're doing there. It transpires once March looks into this case a little deeper. The body is that of a fairly prominent SS functionary who was instrumental in, there's this kind of permanent, how can we describe this, the elephant in the room throughout this is the matter of the absence of anyone Jewish from Germany at this point in history. And March has sort of this particular resonance with this because the flat he lives in was just handed to him without all the evidence of its previous occupants being cleared away. So there's this photo of this family, and he's unwise enough to start asking questions about this. It transpires that they were a Jewish family who disappeared in the night for what's euphemistically referred to as deployment out east. So this is this sort of huge elephant in the room. People are sort of aware that it's happened. No one really wants to talk about it or ask too many questions about it. But the body in the lake is someone who was involved in this process. So now March finds himself, incidentally, the historical timeline, a big part of this is that 20 years after the war, there's been the equivalent of the Cold War between Germany and the US, both being nuclear powers at this point. Germany had succeeded in exploding with one of the Wunderwaffen that never quite happened. It sort of predicts Germany getting further technologically than they did and being able to explode a nuclear warhead over New York, thus forcing the Americans into this kind of standoff. So there's been a Cold War for 20 odd years, and they're now at this historical point of Entente Cordiale, it's referred to. So you've got the president. I think the idea is that the president of the US is Kennedy's dad, and at this point they're looking at kind of a thawing of relations between Germany and the States. So they're plotting, this visit by Kennedy is due, so they're brightening up the city and all this. So evidence of this mass deployment east, they don't want that sort of bubbling up at this point. Now, this case that March finds himself involved in, while he's looking into it, he's becoming more and more intrigued, contrary to, his self-preservation instincts. The more he looks into it, the more it sort of resonates with this question of, what happened to those people in the 1940s. And abruptly the case is taken off his hands by the secret police, the Gestapo. Now, he doesn't take the hint from this and continues to sort of pretend not to have got the memo and digs a little deeper. Well, it brings him into the orbit of this American journalist lady, but it also brings him to the attention of the kind of highly placed personages within the SS that really aren't going to do him any favours. One of this is the high-ranking SS police functionary Arthur Naber, known colloquially around as Uncle Arthur. He is played in the film by Peter Vaughan, which I did think was a good bit of casting, actually. He conveys this manner of sort of congenial menace, I suppose, quite well. So on their first kind of discussion, on the surface, Uncle Arthur Naber is as congenial a character as you could hope to make a man who historically was up to his neck in mass murder during the Second World War. However, he is, I suppose, the lesser evil to the other person involved, the other prominent historical person, who is Odilo Globoknik, known colloquially as Globus. And nothing good is going to come from a man called Globus. It's just too much like globule, isn't it? He is the more noxious of the pair. He's described historically. Historian Michael Allen described him as the vilest individual in the vilest organisation ever known. So there's this kind, although Neighbour is nominally Globus's chief, there's this kind of playoff between them, and I suppose March finds himself, he's kind of being played in a way, but is by Neighbour against, playing off against Globus, but he's kind of too curious in spite of himself. Now that's as far as I've reread. I do have a dim idea how it goes from there, and of course I have watched the film more recently. I can't remember if that's up on YouTube or not, but now it still stands as a very effective historical or parallel historical thriller in which Robert Harris, I think, quite successfully constructs the whole feeling of living in this society that has been given another 20 years more than it really got. And also Harris kind of constructs this, he describes this whole, as I think was planned, this kind of rebuilding of Germany. Albert Speer's plans for Berlin to be the heart of this new German empire, and these gargantuan pompous constructions around the place, like the People's Hall or whatever it was going to be called, this huge dome which is large enough to sustain its own microclimate, because if you've got 180,000 people in there with, I suppose, 60 standard ventilation, you're going to get condensation in the roof and light rainfall or what have you. And also these vast railway termini, there's these kind of Snowpiercer sized trains. There's also, I believe there were plans for this, these kind of huge ultra broad gauge train servicing lines to and from the outposts of this vast empire, going out beyond, these kind of badlands beyond Moscow, where this sort of endless guerrilla warfare is carried out, and where the eager or uneager conscripts or volunteers find themselves being sent. And in fact, the young man who discovers the body, once Globus and Neighbour get wind that he might know too much or have seen too much, he's swiftly dispatched out there himself, probably to a bad end. So I would say, if there are comparisons, I mean, some come to mind. You might compare it. There's the Bernie Gunter mysteries, which sort of describe the nuts and bolts of a private detective operating within Germany during the 30s and 40s, and what kind of existence that would have been. There's quite a few titles in that series, I believe. They are similarly, they transport you to a historical place and time fairly convincingly. There's those. This also reminds me in a way of Hans Helmut Kirst's Night of the Generals, in the supposition that you're in a job where you're charged supposedly with implementing justice within a regime that just flourishes on injustice, a regime that just does the opposite, and the paradox that presents, and the advisability of taking your job a little bit too literally for your own good. But anyway, that's me on this. Thank you very much for joining me. I do hope I will see you again. Thank you.